Visa Dama bisa dibuat PR dengan maksimal umur. Mas, visa apa yang bisa untuk kerja buat kita semua umur 40 tahun ke atas dan yang mau tinggal dan kerja di area regional? Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Balik lagi di Sargindo Channel. Gimana kabar kalian hari ini guys? Saya harap kalian baik-baik saja dimanapun berada. Terima kasih buat teman-teman yang sudah share dan subscribe video saya hingga sekarang ini. Semoga video saya bisa memberi manfaat serta menambah wawasan buat teman-teman yang sekiranya mau ke Australia dan yang sudah di Australia. Saya mohon maaf apabila beberapa minggu yang lalu kita tidak bisa membuat video karena memang saya lagi sakit, dan alhamdulillah sekarang dalam masa recovery saya sudah bisa menjalani aktivitas seperti biasa. Dan terima kasih juga buat teman-teman yang sudah DM saya serta komen yang serta-merta mendukung saya untuk kembali lagi sehat seperti semula. Terima kasih banyak. Kita tidak tahu banget kapan atau di mana kesehatan kita akan diuji. Yang penting saya berharap buat teman-teman di sana tetap selalu sehat dan selalu jaga kesehatan. Hari ini saya akan share ke teman-teman tentang salah satu topik yang dimana banyak yang ditanyakan oleh teman-teman di sana, gimana cara kerja ke Australia, gimana cara masuk ke Australia, dan lain-lain. Apabila teman-teman waktu itu masih ingat, saya pernah share di IG saya, dan apabila teman-teman belum follow IG saya, monggo silahkan. Kalau mau follow monggo, kalau mau skip monggo. Ada di Real Sargindo Channel tanpa spasi. Jadi buat teman-teman yang waktu itu sudah follow saya pernah share bahwa saya mengikuti webinar yang ada di Darwin sini, tapi pembawa acaranya atau narasumbernya bukan dari Darwin, tapi langsung dari New South Wales di kota Sydney sendiri. Nama agennya yaitu IARC, kalau masih ingat teman-teman, yaitu Immigration Advice and Resource Center, yang dimana ini adalah legal immigration advice. Jadi di video kali ini saya bukan sebagai legal advice seperti dari agen-agen kayak gitu, bukan. Saya hanya menyampaikan apa yang saya ikutin di webinar tersebut, dan saya mikirnya teman-teman yang di luar sana mungkin butuh info seperti ini, monggo. Jadi buat teman-teman yang mau ngikutin terus video ini sampai habis, nanti saya cantumkan seluruh pertanyaannya atau seluruh videonya, hampir setengah jam saya cantumkan di video ini. Dan secepatnya tolong dilihat. Apabila teman-teman berkenan, monggo direkam atau juga di download, terus buat teman-teman ditonton ulang dan sebagainya. Dan di situ nanti ada juga semua pertanyaan bermacam-macam, dari nggak cuma dari satu kota tapi juga dari kota lain, nggak cuma dari satu visa tapi juga dari visa yang lain. Dan di sini memakai bahasa Inggris. Jadi inilah video yang memakai bahasa Inggris yang asli dari Australia. Apabila teman-teman berkenan untuk belajar bahasa Inggrisnya Australia atau mengenal bahasa Inggrisnya Australia itu seperti apa, monggo bisa ditonton di akhir video ini. Dan di sini saya tidak akan membahas seluruh pertanyaan yang saya ikutin di webinar tersebut karena banyak banget. Saya hanya akan membahas beberapa poin saja yang menurut saya itu penting. Kita mulai dari pertanyaan satu, yang dimana ada pertanyaan, apakah visa 403 itu bisa melanjutkan ke permanent resident? Kalau teman-teman dulu pernah ngikutin dan save video saya yang atau status saya yang ada di IG, saya pernah memberi pertanyaan seperti ini, yang dimana ada cara terbaik untuk mendapatkan PR? Bisakah perusahaan deportasi saya? Bagaimana jika saya bekerja di perusahaan yang mensponsori saya dan saya diberhentikan secara tidak adil dan dipaksa untuk pergi atau pulang kampung karena kondisi visa saya? Ini yang saya pernah share ke teman-teman lewat IG saya. Jadi di pertanyaan pertama itu, apakah visa 403 itu bisa menuju ke PR pathway? Dan jawabannya itu adalah bisa, yang dimana kemungkinan pathway-nya itu 482. 482 itu visa apa, Mas? Visa kerja. 403 itu juga visa kerja. Jadi buat teman-teman di sini itu perlu diketahui dulu kalau mau ke Australia itu memilih visa seperti apa. Jadi buat teman-teman yang sudah memegang visa 482 itu ada peluang gitu loh untuk PR. Terus yang kedua, ini banyak banget pertanyaan. Ini saya rangkum aja, nggak semuanya pertanyaannya. Yang kedua, banyak banget, Mas, visa apa yang bisa untuk kerja buat kita semua umur 40 tahun ke atas? Jadi di sini, apakah ada pendaftaran visa tinggal sementara untuk umur lebih dari 40 tahun dan yang mau tinggal dan kerja di area regional? Area regional itu seperti apa, Mas? Area regional itu di luar kota-kota besar. Di luar kota-kota besar seperti apa? Jadi nanti teman-teman itu ke Australia itu harus memikirkan juga gitu loh. Teman-teman mau di mana? Gitu loh, kerjanya atau kuliahnya atau studinya atau menetapnya itu di mana. Jadi seperti ini, saya gampangnya aja saya kasih gambar seperti ini, nanti saya cantumin di video. Jadi di major cities itu kategori 1 itu seperti Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, kayak gitu, kota-kota besar. Itu adalah major cities, bukan regional. Yang kedua, yang berwarna kuning, cities and major regional centers. Itu bukan regional areas. Yang warna hijau itu adalah regional center and other regional areas. Jadi kalau seumpama gampangnya, teman-teman memilih NT. NT berada di ujung Australia, berwarna hijau, pasti itu adalah regional area. Darwin dan sekitarnya, NT keseluruhan. NT itu apa, Mas? Northern Territory. Jawabannya adalah visa yang bisa dibuat untuk kerja lebih dari umur 40 dan yang interested atau yang mau tinggal dan kerja di area regional, yaitu 482. Kenapa? Karena visa 482 ini no limit. Mereka sudah mencantumkan di website imigrasi itu nggak ada age limit, guys. Jadi antara umur 40 tahun sampai lebih dari 40 tahun usia senior itu teman-teman bisa apply. Tapi harus dilihat dulu syarat-syaratnya. Syarat visa ini itu sudah diubah juga. Yang dulunya pengalaman kerjanya itu harus lebih dari 1 tahun. Tapi di tahun yang baru ini mereka membuatnya lebih ringkas atau membuat pengalaman kerja yang teman-teman punya itu lebih rendah. Jadi yang dulu seumpama lebih dari 1 tahun, tapi sekarang cukup 1 tahun saja. Kalau seumpama teman-teman pernah dengar visa Dama, nah salah satunya visa Dama itu ya, kita akan bahas visa Dama tersebut. Visa Dama itu standar age limitnya tergantung dari state dan teritori yang ada. Contoh, visa Dama concession ini menuju PR. Visa Dama bisa dibuat PR dengan maksimal umur 45 tahun. General age requirement, standard age limit. Jadi, for the standard INS subclass 186 visa, applicants are typically required to be under 45 years of age at the time of their permanent resident visa application. Jadi 186 ini visa permanen. Dama age concessions. Dama agreements provide age concessions, allowing older applicants to access permanent resident pathway. Jadi di sini visa Dama itu bisa dibuat untuk PR, tapi ada umur concessionnya atau age concessionnya gitu loh. Contoh, examples of Dama age concessions. Northern Territory Dama. skill level 1 sampai 4 itu harus di bawah 55 tahun pada waktu apply permanent resident. Jadi teman-teman masih bisa apply permanent resident pada umur segitu, hanya di NT. Skill level 1 sampai 4 itu seperti apa, Mas? Skill level 1 contohnya seperti bachelor degree, master degree, dan lain-lain. Level 2 ke bawah itu di bawahnya level S1, bachelor degree, dan lain-lain kayak gitu. Terus skill level 5 occupations under 50 years of age. Di state lain, Great South Coast, Dama, itu skill level 5-nya itu 50 tahun sama dengan NT, tapi di Orana, Dama itu berbeda. Applicants must be under 45 years old for the permanent residence pathway through INS. Apa itu INS, Mas? Employer Nomination Scheme. Jadi sponsor dari employer. Ada banyak Dama di Australia. Contohnya di Adelaide, East Kimberley, Far North Queensland, Goulburn Valley, Victoria, Great South Coast, Victoria. Jadi teman-teman itu harus memikirkan di mana teman-teman akan memilih tempat. NT, WA, Victoria, New South Wales. Teman-teman harus memikirkan lebih jauh lagi. Visa 186 ANS, Employer Nomination Scheme, PR can be cancelled if they left the company. Jadi ada pertanyaan gitu loh, apakah kita bisa di cancel visa kita atau permanent resident kita apabila kita meninggalkan perusahaan tersebut? Jawabannya itu tergantung gitu loh. Ada syarat yang tertera di visa 186 ini. Kita harus bekerja selama 2 tahun dengan perusahaan yang sponsoring kita. Jadi setelah visa 186 permanent visa itu granted, teman-teman tidak ada binding atau tidak ada kerjasama lagi dengan perusahaan tersebut, kecuali kalau si aplikan ini mempunyai keinginan untuk meninggalkan company tersebut sebelum visa permanent residentnya itu granted. Permanent visa ini bisa di-cancel entah dari company sendiri atau perusahaan sendiri atau dari immigration. Ada forklift driver yang sudah bekerja 10 tahun di Australia, apakah bisa mendapatkan permanent resident yang perusahaan itu tidak mau sponsorin? Jawabannya, karena dia di sini itu punya skill visa pathway, bisa dilihat ada peluang visa gitu loh, yang dimana skill forklift ini itu bisa di-apply-kan atau bisa apply PR itu dengan apply visa 190, 189 atau 491 independent skill visa. Kalau perusahaan tidak mau mensponsorin teman-teman atau si forklift driver ini, teman-teman harus cari state lain yang mau sponsorin teman-teman gitu loh. Contoh, kita mempunyai forklift driver yang ada di New South Wales, Sydney, tapi perusahaan tersebut nggak mau sponsorin. Yang mau sponsorin adalah yang di NT. Jadi monggo teman-teman cari perusahaan yang ada di NT gitu loh. Tapi kalau seumpama dua-duanya ini perusahaan nggak mau sponsorin si forklift driver, teman-teman harus cari juga bisa. Salah satunya jalan keluarnya yaitu mencari state nomination atau territory, istilahnya sponsor dari pemerintah kota tersebut. Tapi untuk lebih jelasnya lagi, teman-teman harus bisa mendapatkan skill assessment dan lain-lain, semua persyaratannya. Yang jelas visa 482 ini IELTS-nya. Kalau teman-teman belum pernah tes IELTS, gimana bisa kita komunikasi dengan bahasa Inggris di sini, di Australia? Sedangkan Australia sendiri membutuhkan IELTS atau kelancaran bahasa Inggris setiap harinya. Jadi bisa dipertanyakan sendiri ke teman-teman, apakah teman-teman itu sudah siap untuk apply visa ini dan lain-lain. Syaratnya itu semuanya balik lagi ke teman-teman. Kita langsung lanjut. Visa 482 selesai 2 tahun, apakah bisa langsung ke PR? Ya, jawabannya bisa, tapi harus ke visa selanjutnya, yaitu visa 186. Sama seperti tadi, harus mencari visa sponsorship atau employer sponsorship, kayak gitu. Terus, apakah visa 482 itu bisa pergi ke luar negeri atau dalam arti liburan lah, atau pergi-pergi dan lain-lain, cuti kayak gitu? Jawabannya iya, tapi tidak setelah teman-teman kontraknya habis. Kalau teman-teman seumpama punya kontrak habis setelah 2026 atau 2025 ini, bulan Agustus ini, terus teman-teman mau keluar dari Australia, teman-teman nggak bisa balik lagi. Karena apa? Ya, teman-teman kalau balik lagi, visanya visa apa? Kalau visa 482, kontraknya aja sudah habis, gitu loh. Jadi teman-teman jangan sampai keluar dari Australia apabila teman-teman belum mendapatkan visa terbaru, pengganti visa 482 ini. Karena kalau teman-teman balik ke sini, lah perusahaannya kan sudah selesai kontraknya dengan teman-teman. Ngapain gitu loh balik ke sini lagi? Terus fungsinya kerja dengan siapa gitu loh. Jadi diusahakan sebelum keluar atau sebelum liburan dan lain-lain, itu teman-teman mencari dulu perusahaan atau mencari tempat kerja lagi yang mau mensponsorin atau yang mau apply teman-teman untuk ke jenjang permanent resident dengan memakai skill yang teman-teman punya gitu loh. Nah, kalau sudah dapat visa baru, boleh keluar untuk liburan atau yang lain, itu nggak masalah. Tapi kalau seumpama teman-teman pengen keluar dalam jangka waktu visa 482 ini masih aktif, tidak di akhir kontrak itu bisa mengajukan di company atau bisa discuss langsung dengan supervisor atau coordinator dan lain-lain. Yang jelas visa teman-teman ini required untuk 2 tahun kerja. Teman-teman harus full time 2 tahun kerja dengan perusahaan tersebut. Pada waktu visa 482 ini yang teman-teman punya itu masih aktif, tapi perusahaan itu bangkrut atau situasinya itu finansialnya itu minus. Apakah bahaya buat kita? Nah, itu bisa juga bahaya atau bisa juga tidak, itu semua tergantung gitu loh. Jadi teman-teman harus bisa memikirkan juga gitu loh, wah kalau seumpama company seperti ini, apakah nanti kedepannya bagus buat saya, buat saya sendiri untuk mencari sponsor gitu loh. Tanyakan ke teman-teman lain atau bisa ke agen langsung. Nah, saya mendapatkan video ini atau webinar ini itu berasal dari UU, yaitu organization yang dimana organisasi ini namanya United Workers Union. Jadi teman-teman di Australia itu kerja bakal di cover. Organisasi ini akan membela teman-teman gitu loh, entah itu dari wages, entah itu dari hak teman-teman, entah itu dari visa teman-teman yang sewajarnya berdasarkan hukum di Australia. Apakah organisasi ini ada di luar Australia, Mas? Saya kurang tahu, tapi yang jelas ada di Darwin. Bisa Google aja United Workers Union dan di situ nanti banyak gitu loh keterangannya. Apa saja yang akan mereka lakukan ke teman-teman, apa saja yang mereka bantu ke teman-teman untuk mendapatkan hak teman-teman, dari gaji, dari long service leave, dari cuti, dari apapun yang teman-teman berhak dapatkan dari perusahaan tersebut gitu loh. Jadi ada benefitnya juga gitu loh buat kita. Selain menjadi member tersebut, itu kita juga akan diberi free webinar atau free online webinar yang bisa kita attending itu dimanapun, dan itu semuanya bermanfaat banget gitu loh buat kita, khususnya para migran. Nah, buat teman-teman, monggo kalau habis gini mau tonton videonya sampai habis. Ini adalah seluruh pertanyaan yang ada di webinar tersebut. Teman-teman boleh download, boleh screenshot atau boleh rekam, terserah, monggo. Semoga video ini tidak di take down sama YouTube. Tolong secepatnya dicatat atau di download buat teman-teman apabila teman-teman berkenan dan sekiranya teman-teman butuhkan. Saya mohon maaf apabila saya salah kata, dan buat teman-teman di sana, semoga video saya tetap membuat teman-teman bisa mencari jalan atau celah buat teman-teman ke Australia. Nah, Mas, kalau seumpama saya nggak ada skill buat ke Australia, ya salah satunya kita harus belajar. Kalau belajar, ya berarti jadi student. Nah, student berarti visanya beda lagi. Oke? Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sampai ketemu di video selanjutnya.
Had lots of questions, which is very much what I thought would be the case. So, Anne and Chrissy, I will let you decide who answers each one. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, is that if you're one of our aged care members and have a question around the aged care labour agreements, the best people to talk to about that is actually your organisers and the people in the officials in our aged care team. So if you need a hand with any issues relating to those, do reach out. Arietta is on a 403 visa, and they understand there's no chance for a pathway to PR, but they're wondering if it's possible to change from 403 to a 482, and they have 2 years left on their current 403 visa.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So generally, if you hold a 403 visa, which is also colloquially, well, I'm assuming it's a PALM visa, there are different streams to the 403, but I'm going to base it on that assumption. It is possible for a PALM visa or a 403 visa to have a no further stay condition attached. So the first thing you would need to do is just double check if you have that condition attached to your visa. Assuming that you don't, to my mind, that there's no bar from someone holding a 403 visa to apply for a 482 visa. I guess the things that you'd need to look at would be, firstly, talk to your employer about whether or not they're able to sponsor you. Secondly, looking at whether or not your occupation is eligible for sponsorship. There's quite a few steps the employer will need to consider. So, for example, if your salary meets the requirements, if they're eligible to sponsor anyone just based on like the size and scope of the business and things like that. They also need to consider the Australian labour market. They might need to advertise the position depending on a number of different factors. So it is something that if you're interested in, you could talk to your employer about. The department also for a 482 visa will consider like compliance with other visa conditions. So in the meantime, it'll be important to continue to comply with the conditions of the PALM visa until you've moved on to a different visa subclass.
Sounds like there's some hope there.
Yeah, and also if it is a PALM visa, it might also be a good idea to look at the 192 visa, the new Pacific Islands ballot. It might be a good idea to throw your hat in the ring there as well.
Okay, our next question is from Amber in Queensland, who's wondering if there's some kind of temporary visa that people over the age of 40 can apply for, particularly if they're willing to work and live regionally.
For a temporary visa, was that, or a permanent one?
A temporary working visa, yeah.
Thank you. So a 482 visa doesn't have an age limit. There are a number of criteria you would need to meet, I guess particularly occupation, and you'd need to show that you have at least 12 months experience, which is another change to the 482 that I didn't mention previously, but the work experience requirement for a 482 has been reduced to 12 months. So yeah, there's no cap on age for a 482 visa. Unfortunately, there are caps for all of the permanent residency pathways. So 45 is the cutoff for most of the skilled visa pathways. There are some limited exceptions, but generally speaking, it is a hard cutoff of 45. Also, I guess if you have family pathways, that might be another thing to look at. So if you had like a partner in Australia or perhaps a child that could sponsor you and had the funds to do that, that would be another pathway.
We have a question from Serena, who is wondering if it's possible to apply for permanent residency after 2 years on a 403 visa?
The 403 visa, it doesn't have a direct pathway to permanent residency. So the time spent working on a 403 visa doesn't give you access to a further pathway. Really what you'd be looking at would be if you have another pathway that you can go down to be eligible for permanent residency. So you'd be looking at whether or not there's something in the employer-sponsored stream. So for example, if your occupation was on an eligible list to go down one of the independent skilled visa pathways, they involve, that's like the 189 or the 190, lodging an expression of interest and hoping that the government invites you to apply for a visa. Otherwise, if you're in an occupation that's on one of the relevant lists, you could also talk to your employer about whether or not they're able to sponsor you for permanent residency that way. But unfortunately, time spent working in Australia doesn't automatically lead to a visa pathway unless you can identify a visa that you're eligible for.
We have a question from the very mysterious S, who is an Australian citizen. They've been out of the country for a while and they're wondering if there's any limit to how long they can be away for, and also when re-entering Australia, do they need any kind of documents or police clearance or anything, or is an Australian passport enough?
Yeah. So if you're a citizen, generally there's no limit to how long you can be outside of Australia to be eligible to return. Generally, you're not required to provide police clearances either, although you might have on your incoming passenger card questions about criminal records that you might be required to answer. But yeah, there's no limit on the amount of, like, Australian citizenship doesn't expire unless it's cancelled or you, revoke your own citizenship, then that doesn't expire. I guess there's a difference between being a permanent resident and being a citizen. So if you are a permanent resident, you just need to make sure that the travel facility on your permanent residency hasn't passed. So usually if you're a permanent resident, you get a travel facility for 5 years. And if you're wanting to travel outside of Australia and return after that 5-year period, you'd need to apply for a resident return visa. Resident return visas can be granted for 3 months or up to 5 years. So if you hold a resident return visa, it's also important to just double check the travel facility that you have on that before departing and returning.
I was going to be all try and say, you'll be fine. I'm so pleased I didn't do that. Defer to the expert. Lesson learnt. So this question is from an anonymous attendee who's wondering, what are the benefits they can apply for as a new visa holder of a 190 visa? They've been living in Australia for more than 11 years.
Oh, okay, cool. So that's kind of falls outside of the scope of what we can advise on. I hope I'm interpreting this correctly, but I imagine that you're talking about Centrelink benefits and things like that. If that's the case, then I think you could either check with Centrelink directly or otherwise get advice from somewhere. In New South Wales, we have an organisation called the Welfare Rights Centre, and they're a community legal centre that advises on rights to government services, but perhaps there's a similar organisation wherever you're living. But if you've been holding the visa for more than 11 years, just have a check there. I think there might be a difference between what permanent residents are entitled to and what citizens are entitled to. So it might also be a good idea to look into whether or not you're eligible for citizenship, and that might change your entitlements in terms of Centrelink and other services.
Thanks, Christy. So we have a question from Jen, who is wondering, can PR be cancelled if you leave your employer after it's been granted? And also Jen noted that her PR is 186 ENS.
Okay, so with a 186 visa, you have to have the intention to work for your employer for at least 2 years after the date of visa grant. And as the visa applicant, you have to have that intention throughout processing up until the point that the visa is granted. After the point that the visa is granted, there's no condition that binds you to that employer. So essentially, after a 186 visa is granted, there's nothing tying you to that employer. In terms of potential cancellation, the only ground that I can see would be if there was some suspicion that you had the intention to leave your employer before you were granted PR. But anything that occurs after the point that you're granted the 186 visa, there's no condition that you remain with that employer.
So Jennifer is being sponsored by her employer as a room leader, I'm assuming in early childhood education, and is about to be promoted. Congratulations, to assistant centre manager. Should she therefore apply for a new visa? Does that sort of change does the new position sort of change anything to do with the visa as well?
And was that, sorry, I think I missed a part. That was a 482 visa that you hold?
She says sponsorship, so I assume so.
Yeah. Okay, have to have a check what your visa is. Generally, where you hold a 482 visa, which is the most common kind of temporary skilled visa. So I will assume it's that, but this could be wrong. And I guess that's why, as Anne said, it's really important to get individual advice to make sure that the advice is specific to your circumstances. But if a person holds a 482 visa, there's a condition that attaches that requires that you work for your nominating employer in the nominated occupation for the period of time that you hold the 482 visa. That nominated occupation has really specific, if you look onto ANSCO, which is where the department gets their information on what like different occupations do, it has specific tasks and duties that are listed. If the tasks and duties that you're doing in your new job change, then you could be in breach of your 482 visa condition. So if the new role is different in a way that means that you're not doing the tasks and duties that were listed in your 482 nomination application, your employer might need to lodge a new 482 nomination application, and you might need to lodge a new 482 visa application, and you might need to wait to start the new role until that new 482 visa is granted. But you can have a check through. You could ask your employer for a copy of your position description for both roles and a copy of what was provided in the nomination application, and then get advice to see if you need to change anything there or need to be careful about working in breach.
I hope this isn't a completely different answer, but Jennifer updated us and it's a 494 visa.
Oh, cool. I think a 494 is reasonably the same. I can quickly double check that. Just bear with me a moment. Sorry if the live search. I can't see anything that I think that advice would be different. I can't see any obligation there in terms of the duties that you're performing, but I'm not sure if your employer would have an obligation to notify the department of the change. But I don't see a risk of you being in breach in those circumstances. I can't see a condition on the 494, but maybe for peace of mind, it might be a good idea just to get a referral for someone to look at your matter specifically.
Thanks for checking that, Christy.
No worries.
So Devinda in South Australia has been working as a personal care worker for 3 years and is wondering, assuming their employer is open to it, could they sponsor them on a 186 visa, noting that Devinda is over 45 years old?
Oh, unfortunately, the answer is probably not. The 186 is really strict in terms of the age restrictions. There's some really minimal exemptions depending on occupation. Sorry, what was the occupation again? The role?
Personal care worker.
Personal care worker. To my mind, there's no exemption available. So unfortunately, I don't think that would be possible. But you could talk to your employer if they have a labour agreement in place. And if you're working on a labour agreement, essentially a labour agreement is a contract between the government and your employer, and they can vary the terms of the visa requirements. They might have something in place that's varied the age limit, but that otherwise it's really strict.
Seems to be the case with a lot of the rules.
Yeah.
This one might be tricky, but I'll pop it out there. So Amit is wondering if someone is working as a forklift driver in a distribution centre for over 10 years. I guess, is there any sort of pathway to permanent residency if their employer is unwilling to sponsor them?
Unwilling to sponsor them? Unfortunately, I don't believe so. Really what you would be looking at, if in any case that you're looking at a skilled visa pathway and your employer is not willing to sponsor you, you'd really be looking at either the 190, which is the state nominated permanent residency pathway, which has like a minimum point score that you need to receive, which is 65 points, but often it's higher to actually receive an invitation. You need to be under 45 years of age and your occupation needs to be listed on one of the lists. I don't believe forklift driver is listed, but I could be wrong. And you'd also have to look at each state to see what they have listed as, sometimes, for example, New South Wales has a list of occupations that they're targeting in terms of invitations. So you'd want to check there as well. But yeah, I don't think there'd be a skilled pathway, unfortunately, in those circumstances. There's 190, 189 and the 491 are the independent skilled visas that require invitations, and those would be options in the case that your employer was not willing to sponsor you, but they all have an age cutoff of 45 and they all rely on your occupation being listed on one of their, the relevant list.
This is probably a common one. It looks like that sort of applies to some other people as well. Wondering if on a 482 visa you can go to, visit your home country and then return.
Yes, so you can In most circumstances, a 482, you can travel freely up until that visa expires. I say most circumstances because, most of the time it's fine to travel. The only case where I would be cautious about traveling would be if, say, for example, you've ended your employment and you're traveling, because if you finish your employment and you leave Australia, the department can cancel your visa without notice. So if you think there's any circumstances that could give rise to visa cancellation, it's always better to remain in the country, because usually the department would need to send you what they call a notice of intention to consider cancellation before they cancel your visa, and they're not required to send that to you if you're offshore. So theoretically, yes, you can travel on a 482 visa in most circumstances. In 99% of cases, it's fine. I would be really cautious about traveling if you've finished working for your employer but are planning to return, because your visa could be liable to cancellation. I've just found something on the 494 thing, so I might come back to that if that's okay.
Sure.
So it is similar to the 482. So what I described in terms of potentially being in breach is still there. So I think it would be best just to get advice on that, so someone can actually look at how significant the difference between the two roles is. If it's actually just a different title but still within the same occupation, I think it would be fine, but I think it would probably be a good idea just to get advice on that.
Thanks for that, and hopefully, Jennifer, that will set you on the right track. Question is wondering if the current work restrictions for student visas, is it 20 or 24 hours per week?
Oh, I'll just double check that as well. My understanding is that it's 48, but I'll just quickly double check. Yeah, so looking at what's currently in the current condition says 40 hours per fortnight.
Right.
Yeah, so I think it is 20 hours a week then.
I think we might maybe just take that one on notice, because I think it's written, it's actually strangely difficult to read it in the condition. So we might just double check that one. I could do that in the background.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Oh, Jennifer says thank you. Look, there are lots of aged care, and I don't want to skip you all because lots of people came. So this member is on a student visa working in aged care as a care worker in South Australia. What are some of the pathways, I guess, to permanent residency within the care work sector?
Yeah, okay. So generally within the aged care sector, the key pathway to permanent residency is the new Aged Care Industry Labour Agreement, the AILA. So looking for an employer who's signed up to the AILA would be the most secure pathway. The reason for that is because the aged care occupations generally don't appear on the other skilled lists that are required in order to be eligible for permanent residency. So really you'd be looking to see if you can find an employer who's listed on the AILA and is willing to sponsor you. It is possible for an employer to be able to sponsor someone directly for a 186 visa under the AILA, or otherwise you could hold a 482 visa and then apply after you've held it for 2 years.
Sorry, that sort of leads into another question I just saw here, which is someone who's completing 2 years under a 482 labour agreement visa, and is wondering, can they apply for permanent residency once they've completed the 2 years? Also, it's a bit of a two-parter. If there are any other options if their employer doesn't want to sponsor them for permanent residency.
Yeah, okay. So really the pathway that you would be looking at would be, so after having held the 482 visa, it doesn't lead to an independent pathway for permanent residency. You still require an employer to sponsor you. So you'd need to talk to your employer about whether or not they're able to submit an application to nominate you for a 186 visa.
Alessia is wondering if they're applying for a 186 direct stream visa or a 482. However, the company's financial statement it says negative, so I'm assuming that means, poor. Is that going to ring alarm bells, I guess? Is that going to be a problem if the employer is sort of not doing well financially?
It's possible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be possible for them to nominate you. When the department is considering an application when they're considering whether or not an employer is able to sponsor someone, they do consider whether or not the company is able to financially meet the obligations that they're implying that they can in the application. So it is possible. It's kind of outside of the scope of what we advise on, just because we only really advise visa applicants. But if it's something that you're worried about, it might be something to have a talk to your employer about, and maybe also see if they're able to ask that question of any migration agent or lawyer that they've retained for the application as well. It's not black and white. Just because they've had like a negative financial year doesn't necessarily mean they won't be able to sponsor.
What sort of kind of on that, and this is really my question, but what does happen to workers on visas if a company, goes into liquidation or, if it fails, basically?
So if a company, I guess it depends on which visa the person holds. In some circumstances, they could be fine. So if they've been nominated for permanent residency and the application's already been approved, they'll be fine. If they have an application pending and the company goes into liquidation and their employment ceases, that'll impact their eligibility for the grant of the visa. We do see this quite a bit, not too often. I don't want to speak anyone. We do see this sometimes, I should say, where people have lodged a 186 visa. Like I mentioned before, the employer has to guarantee that the position will be available for at least 2 years after the grant of the visa. And sometimes where they aren't doing well financially or the company is wrapping up but the visa application is still in processing, then it might come to a point where the application is unlikely to be successful. If the person holds like a temporary work visa and it's linked to a company who is winding up and their employment ceases, then that can also impact the worker's ability to comply with their work condition. Under the new rules for the 482 visa and for the 494 visa as well. Oh, is it for the 494 visa as well? Actually, just for the 482 visa, I think. Might have to double check that as well. But for the 482 visa, at least for the purposes of my example, they'll have 180 days to find a new employer or to work for themselves or to work for someone else until they can find a new employer to sponsor them. What we have seen in some circumstances as well is that like another company will take over that organisation, like they'll take over the whole organisation, and in some circumstances that might allow them to take over the sponsorship. It just depends very much on like business law and what actually has happened in terms of a takeover. But so it's definitely something that can impact your visa. So if you have concerns about the financial status of the company, or if the company seems like they might be winding up, definitely a good idea to get advice about your visa, and also have some like frank conversations with your employer about what their plans are for the future.
So Holly has moved to the Northern Territory on a 485 temporary graduate visa and has found work in their study-related field in public health. They were told after working for 1 year they could apply for a 491 visa, and they're wondering if that's sort of for a certain field or if there's any other requirement associated with the 491.
Yeah, so the 491 visa is temporary regional visa. It's like a provisional regional visa that has a pathway to permanent residency. So if you get a 491 visa and you hold one, I forgot exactly what the rules are, but there is a pathway to permanent residency. Eventually you'll be able to apply for the 191 visa, assuming you've complied with the conditions of the 491 visa. There are a lot of other requirements. It's a state-nominated application, so you'd need to put in an expression of interest with the Northern Territory government. You can have a look at their website to see if they have particular requirements in terms of like how long you've been living there, what kind of occupation you're in, and things like that. You'll need to get at least a minimum of 65 points to be eligible to get an invitation, although because it's like a demand kind of process, usually people with higher scores are like the higher score, the more likely you are to get an invitation to apply. You also need to meet competent English, and there's health and character requirements as well. But when you have a look at that points test, you'll see that the higher level of English you're able to show that you have based on doing a relevant English language exam, the more points you'll be able to score. You'll also need a positive skills assessment in that occupation. So have a look online. There's lots of good information on the department's website. If you look up the 491 requirements, I think there's also a points calculator you can use if you look up points calculator, Department of Home Affairs. So you can start looking at whether or not you should do an English test just to boost your score. And then also look at the Northern Territory government's website to see if they have particular requirements as well.
An anonymous member has applied for a student visa and they wanted to include their partner as a secondary applicant. They're not married, so does that sort of change whether or not their partner could be eligible?
It can. I want to start off by saying this is a circumstance where I think you should basically always get advice. The reason for that is because there's a couple of different regulations about student visa holders and including secondary applicants. And there's a few circumstances where you need to be really careful. For example, you can only include a secondary applicant in a student visa application if they've either been declared on your your initial primary student visa application as a member of your family unit, or the relationship began after you were granted the visa. And so you really want advice on timing. You probably want to give the solicitor whatever you provided in your previous application, and you'll need to give them like a bit of a rundown of like when the relationship began and things like that. It's possible to include someone as a secondary applicant if you're not married. You just need to show that either you're registered, if that's available in your state, so a registered relationship with birth, deaths and marriages, or that you've been living together for at least 12 months before submitting the application. But I think definitely get advice, because that it trips people up a lot, the requirement in terms of if the person was mentioned in your previous application. So I'd want to be really careful there.
I might also just jump in and recommend getting advice on that one, because basically what you're looking at is whether you meet the de facto definition. I'm not entirely sure if you need to be in the relationship for 12 months if it's a student visa. It's a little different for different visa applications in terms of meeting the de facto definition, but they're kind of looking at, are you living together? Are you sharing your finances? Do family recognise you as a couple and all things like that? So it's, in some cases for married couples, it's not just a matter of like a registration or a marriage certificate. Sometimes it can be scrutinised further than that. And then just to come back, as we are talking about student visas, to the question about the work condition, it was changed in, I think, July 2023 from 40 hours a fortnight to 48 hours a fortnight. It's just strangely quite difficult to read in the condition, because they refer to 40 hours and then at the bottom say, if this relates to a student visa or a bridging visa that is related to a valid application for a student visa, then where we say 40 hours a fortnight, we mean 48 hours a fortnight. So I don't know who wrote this, but it's a bit tricky to read. But just bear in mind, because I think the question was word per week, we are looking at a fortnight. So it depends on any fortnight starting on a Monday, calculating 48 hours of work in that fortnight. So you could work longer in one week of the fortnight and less in the next week of the fortnight, and it total 48 hours, but you could work more than 24 hours in 1 week. So you're always looking at a fortnight rather than the week. That makes sense.
Thank you for that clarification. I think I'm going to squeeze in one last question, if you don't mind. So the lucky last for today is, a member, Patrick, is wondering if they can sponsor a skilled relative who's a qualified electrician from overseas under the 190 visa program.
So the 190 program doesn't allow an individual to sponsor someone else. It's one that requires an invitation from the government. So your relative would need to submit an expression of interest and see if they get an invitation to apply. They'll need to do a skills assessment as well and meet those other minimum requirements. But unfortunately, it's not possible to sponsor a family member that way. There's not really, in the family stream, it's more like immediate family member. So they look at sponsoring child, parent, partner. There was previously another pathway where you might have been able to sponsor someone in regional Australia. I'm not sure off the top of my head if that's still open, but the 190, it doesn't allow that, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, we haven't got through all of the questions, but we will circulate with the slides a bunch of links to places where either you might be able to find the information you're looking for, or to other people who might be able to assist you. So some experts who are almost as good as Christy and Anne from some community legal centres around the country. So we've looked some places up for you, and we'll try and put you in touch with some people who can assist. But on that note, I just want to say thank you so much to Christy and to Anne, especially for jumping in at the last minute today. And I hope to all the members who came that you found this really valuable, that you got some helpful information out of it. If you are covered by an award, I recommend you register for our next member workshop in August. I'm pretty sure it's the 12th, where we'll be talking about the recent award wage increase, making sure you know all of the things to check, that you're getting all your entitlements, that your employer hasn't forgotten any of the money that should be going into your pocket. So have a look and sign up for that one if that applies to you. And we'll be sending you the slides from tonight and a survey, because we're always keen to hear about what you thought, and also get your ideas for topics you might like us to look at covering in the future. Good night, and thank you all very much.